The land had a memory, a deep, resonant one that thrummed beneath the feet of the Iceni people. It was a memory of mist-shrouded groves and silver rivers, of gods who spoke in the rustle of oak leaves and the cry of the hawk. It was a memory of freedom, a concept as tangible as the soil and as vital as breath. For centuries, this was the only memory the land knew. Then came the Romans. They brought with them a different kind of memory, one etched in stone, and law carved into straight, relentless roads that sliced through the ancient, curving trackways of the Britons. They brought the hum of Latin, the clatter of legionary sandals, and the cold, unyielding weight of an empire that stretched to deserts the Iceni could not even imagine. It was into this world of clashing memories that Boudica was born, a queen who would become the land's most furious and unforgettable voice. She was not merely a chieftain's wife. She was the heart of her people, a woman of the Iceni nobility, tall and possessing a striking, fearsome beauty. Her hair, a great flame of red gold, fell in thick waves to her waist, a living banner of her spirit. Her voice, when she spoke in the great roundhouse of her husband, King Prasutagus, was not the soft murmur expected of women in the Roman world. It was the instrument of command, deep and resonant, capable of calming a heated council or stirring the blood of warriors. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. They saw the deference the Romans showed her husband, but they also saw the calculation behind it. The Iceni were a client kingdom, a supposed ally of Rome, allowed to keep their lands and their king in exchange for peace, tribute, and a quiet submission to the imperial will. Prasutagus, a pragmatic man, believed he could navigate this delicate peace, that he could secure his people's future and his own legacy by embracing the inevitable. Boudica watched, and she learned, and a slow-burning fire of suspicion kindled in her heart. She saw the Roman merchants with their clever scales and short-changing tricks, the officials with their endless scrolls of taxes, and the soldiers whose eyes, hungry and dismissive, roamed over Iceni lands and Iceni women. The delicate, brittle peace shattered upon the death of Prasutagus. In a final, desperate attempt to preserve his kingdom and provide for his family, he wrote a will. It was a document conceived in a Roman world, and he hoped its logic would be respected. He named the Roman Emperor Nero as co-heir alongside his two young daughters, believing this would flatter Rome's vanity while ensuring his bloodline retained a stake in their own inheritance. It was a tragic miscalculation. To the Roman mind, a client king was a subject, and a subject's possessions were ultimately the property of Rome. A will was an irrelevance. A kingdom without a strong male heir was an invitation. The Roman procurator, Cotus Decianus, the chief financial officer of the province, saw not a legacy to be honored, but an asset to be seized. The arrival of the Roman officials was not a somber procession to pay respects. It was a raid, a cold, administrative annexation. They came with scribes and soldiers, their faces impassive. They declared that the will of Prasutagus was void. The kingdom of the Iceni was dissolved, its lands now the property of the Roman emperor. The noblemen who protested were disarmed, their ancestral weapons, symbols of their status and freedom, confiscated with mocking laughter. The air, once filled with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, grew thick with the stench of fear and injustice. But the worst was yet to come. The officials turned their attention to the royal family itself. They demanded that Boudica, the queen who had stood beside a king, formally submit to Roman rule. She refused, her defiance a spark in a room soaked in oil. What happened next was an act of such calculated, symbolic brutality that it scorched the very soul of the Iceni nation. The Romans, their civilized veneers stripped away, seized Boudica. They stripped her of her royal torque, the heavy gold necklace that marked her rank, and they publicly flogged her, the lash tearing not just at her flesh, but at the dignity of her entire people. As she lay bleeding and humiliated, her two young daughters, the princesses of the Iceni, were dragged away. Their screams echoed through the village, a sound that would forever haunt the memory of those who heard it. The Romans raped them, an act designed not merely to sat lust, but to extinguish a royal line, to desecrate the future of the Iceni, and to demonstrate in the most visceral way possible that they were now a conquered people without rights, without honor, without hope. For a time, there was only silence. A terrible, grieving silence that fell over Boudica and her broken family. But in that silence, the fire of vengeance was forged. The physical wounds of the queen and her daughters began to heal, but the psychological scars festered, transforming into a cold, absolute resolve. Boudica emerged from her ordeal not broken, but transfigured. The noble queen was gone. In her place was an avatar of retribution. She gathered the Iceni chieftains, her body still bearing the marks of the lash, her eyes burning with a new, terrifying light. She spoke not of politics or pragmatism, but of gods and of blood. She spoke of the outrage done to her daughters, to every Iceni man and woman. And the chieftains, their own pride wounded, their own lands threatened, listened. The fire she had carried alone now spread, igniting the hearts of her entire tribe. Yet Boudica's vision was greater than a single tribe's grievance. She knew the Romans were a colossus, and only a united Britannia could hope to topple it. She became a diplomat of rage, sending messengers to the neighboring Trinovantes, who themselves nursed a bitter hatred for Rome. The veterans of the Roman legions had been settled on their best lands at Camulodunum, driving the Trinovantes from their ancestral farms. The great temple to the deified Emperor Claudius stood there, a monstrous stone insult, a symbol of divine and temporal oppression, and the Trinovantes were forced to pay for its upkeep, to fund their own spiritual and physical enslavement. To these people, Boudica was not just an Iceni queen. She was a liberator. They joined her cause, and the rebellion found its critical mass. An army began to form, a vast, seething host of warriors, farmers, and craftsmen, united by a shared, burning hatred. The first target was symbolic. Camulodunum, now a colonia for retired Roman soldiers. It was the very heart of the Roman presence in the East, a bustling town of Roman-style houses, forums, and that hated temple. It was also woefully underdefended, its walls low and its garrison negligible. The Roman authorities, arrogant and blind, dismissed the rumblings of native discontent as the grumblings of savages. They had received pleas for help from the terrified colonists, but the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was far away in the west, campaigning on the island of Mona, the sacred isle of the Druids. The few soldiers sent from the nearest post were a pittance, a gesture of contempt that sealed the town's fate. When Boudica's army fell upon Camulodunum, it was not a battle. It was an avalanche of wrath. The Britons poured from the forests, a tidal wave of painted warriors, their chariots churning the earth, their war horns blaring a terrifying, discordant music. They overwhelmed the meager defenses and surged into the streets. What followed was a slaughter of apocalyptic proportions. The Romans and their British collaborators were shown no mercy. They were dragged from their villas, butchered in the forum, and nailed to the walls. The town was put to the torch, every structure, the homes, the bathhouses, the market, consumed by a purifying fire. The final act was the assault on the Temple of Claudius, where the last remnants of the Roman population had barricaded themselves. For 2 days they held out, until the Britons broke through the doors. The screams from within were swallowed by the roar of the flames as the temple, that great symbol of subjugation, was burned to the ground. The news of Camulodunum's destruction sent a shockwave of terror through the Roman administration and a surge of euphoric hope through the native tribes. Boudica's army, swollen with new recruits, was now an unstoppable force, a migration of an entire people on the warpath. Their next target was the commercial heart of Roman Britannia, Londinium. It was a thriving port town, a hub of trade and money, but like Camulodunum, It was undefended. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, a hardened and ruthless campaigner, had received the news and made a brutal, strategic decision. He force-marched his legions back east, arriving in Londinium ahead of the rebel horde. He assessed the situation with a cold military eye. His force was too small to defend an open town. To stay was to be annihilated. He made the choice to sacrifice Londinium to save the province. He ordered all who could fight to join him and withdrew, leaving the vast majority of the population to their fate. Boudica's army descended upon a city paralyzed with fear. The result was a repeat of Camulodunum, but on a grander, more horrific scale. Londinium was systematically erased. Its wooden buildings were torched, its inhabitants, merchants, families, native Britons who had embraced the Roman way were massacred indiscriminately. Archaeological evidence still bears grim witness to this event. A layer of red ash containing the shattered remains of Roman pottery and the bones of the slain. The army moved on, a force of nature, to Verulamium, a town populated largely by Britons who had become Roman citizens. In Boudica's eyes, they were traitors, and they suffered the same fate. The message was clear. There was no middle ground. You were with Britannia, or you were with Rome. 3 cities lay smoldering in her wake, and over 70,000 Romans and their allies were said to have been slaughtered. The entire Roman project in Britannia teetered on the brink of collapse. But Suetonius Paulinus was not finished. He had used the time bought by the destruction of the towns to gather his forces. He now commanded the seasoned Legio XIV Gemina, parts of the 20th Legion, and all the auxiliaries he could muster, perhaps 10,000 men in total. They were heavily outnumbered, but they were professional soldiers, disciplined and heavily armed. He chose his ground with care, a narrow defile with a dense wood at his back and open ground in front. This protected his flanks and rear, forcing Boudica's immense army to funnel into a frontal assault. On the day of the final battle, the 2 armies faced each other, embodiments of 2 different worlds. On one side, the Romans stood in silent, grim formations, their armor gleaming dully, their javelins poised, a machine of order and death. On the other, the British host was a sprawling, chaotic spectacle of sound and color. Thousands of warriors, their bodies painted with woad, shouted and chanted. Chariots rattled back and forth, their drivers hurling insults. At the center of it all, standing in her chariot with her wounded daughters beside her, was Boudica. She rode from contingent to contingent, her voice rising above the din, a prophetess of freedom. She spoke of the justice of their cause, of the wrongs done to them, of the ancestral gods who fought with them that day. She declared that for the Britons, it was victory or death. The roar that answered her was deafening. It was the roar that undid them. Impatient, confident in their overwhelming numbers, and fired by Boudica's words, the British host surged forward in a great, undisciplined rush. They charged across the open ground, a human tsunami, believing their sheer momentum would shatter the Roman line. It was precisely what Suetonius Paulinus had hoped for. He held his men, letting the Britons come, letting them expend their energy crossing the distance. At the last possible moment, he gave the order. A volley of pila, the heavy Roman javelins, sliced through the air. The iron shanks bent on impact with shields, rendering them useless, and the deadly points punched through flesh. The front ranks of the British charge faltered. Then, in a perfectly executed maneuver, the Roman cohorts advanced in a wedge formation, a human battering ram. The narrow battlefield, which had seemed to offer the Britons a vast army, now became a death trap. Their numbers meant nothing in the confined space. Those at the back pressed forward, shoving those at the front onto the waiting swords of the legionaries. The Romans, protected by their large shields and body armor, methodically cut the Britons down. It was not a fight. It was a butchering. The British war chariots, so effective in open skirmishes, were useless in the press. The tide of battle turned with horrifying speed. The confidence of the Britons curdled into panic, and the advance became a rout. But the Romans had sealed the escape routes. The retreating warriors were trapped against their own baggage train, a sprawling mass of wagons where their families had gathered to watch their triumph. The battle dissolved into a massacre of men, women, children, and animals. The Romans showed no quarter, exacting a terrible price for the 3 burned cities. Of Boudica's fate, the historical records are brief and vary. Tacitus, the more reliable source, writes that she escaped the field and took her own life with poison, choosing a noble death over the humiliation of capture. Cassius Dio claims she fell sick and died. The truth is lost to time. What is certain is that her rebellion died with her on that battlefield. Suetonius Paulinus followed his victory with a campaign of ruthless pacification, laying waste to Iceni and Trinovante lands with fire and sword, until the province was starved into a sullen, bloody submission. In the immediate aftermath, Boudica was a failure. She had unleashed a storm of vengeance that ultimately laid waste to her own people and strengthened the Roman grip on Britannia. The legions built stronger forts, the administration became more controlling, and the memory of her rebellion was suppressed, a cautionary tale of the price of defiance. Yet, history is written not only by the victors, but also by the echoes that refuse to die. The story of the warrior queen, the mother wronged, the leader who united tribes and brought an empire to its knees, refused to be extinguished. It was kept alive in bardic songs and local legends, a whispered myth of a time when Britons were free. Centuries later, when Rome itself had crumbled into dust, her story was rediscovered. During the Renaissance, and particularly in the Victorian era, Boudica was resurrected as a national icon. For a Briton building its own empire, she became a symbol of British spirit, independence, and righteous resistance. Paintings depicted her as a noble, classical heroine. Poems were written extolling her virtue. Her statue, standing proudly in her chariot, was erected near the Houses of Parliament in London, the city she once destroyed. She was no longer a failed rebel, but a foundational myth, a proof of an ancient and indomitable national character. The true story of Boudica lies somewhere between the Roman histories that sought to diminish her and the Victorian sentiment that sought to sanitize her. She was not a symbol. She was a woman of flesh, blood, and towering passion. She was a product of a brutal age, capable of inspiring immense loyalty and presiding over immense cruelty. Her rebellion was not a neatly packaged war for independence, but a raw, chaotic explosion of rage born from profound personal and cultural violation. It was a testament to the fact that even the most powerful empires cannot forever crush the human spirit as desire for dignity. The land remembered its freedom, and for one brilliant bloody moment, it found its voice in a queen whose cry of defiance still echoes a whisper. On the wind, a fire in the dark, an unforgettable reminder that those who are pushed too far have nothing left to lose but their chains.